Okay, if everyone would please take their seats, we're going to begin. Committee on Foreign Affairs will come to order. The purpose of this hearing is to discuss the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation's, DFC's, efforts to outcompete China's Belt and Road Initiative, and discuss the DFC's upcoming reauthorization. I will now recognize myself for an opening statement. The Middle East is on the brink of full-scale war. As Iran and its proxies continue to attack Israel, we are witnessing the largest land invasion in Europe since World War II by Vladimir Putin. And Chairman Xi's China is deliberately testing U.S. resolve as they look to invade Taiwan and spread their malign influence around the world. We are living in dangerous times, and the world is indeed on fire. These dictators, including North Korea, are working together to attack U.S. interests. And this unholy alliance threatens to undermine the global balance of power, Western values, and democratic norms. America's soft power is key to preventing the spread of authoritarianism. Development Finance Corporation, or DFC, plays a crucial role in countering China's predatory development programs, including the Belt and Road. The Belt and Road Initiative is nothing less than a tool of economic coercion, employing debt trap diplomacy, I'll call it, to ensnare nations and place them under the CCP's influence. I'm proud to have been a strong supporter of the 2018 BUILD Act, which established the DFC and gave it a counter-China focus in addition to its development mandate. Across the developing world, China seeks to supplant the United States at any cost. Africa is ground zero for the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP. They are building hard infrastructure, including airports, roads, bridges, seaports, and railways, to extend their influence and financial hold over these nations. Keep in mind, many are dual-use projects and can, in fact, be used by their military. But it's not just Africa. Look at the Solomon Islands, which have now signed a security pact with China. And their influence in the Western Hemisphere is rapidly growing. Look no farther than China's International Deep Space Ground Station in Argentina, or how the CCP are the largest investors in Peru's mining sector and have just constructed a super port. We can't win the game if we are not on the field competing. And that is where the DFC's power lies. The DFC is on the ground advancing America's interests with a mission to help developing nations achieve self-reliance. However, imposing progressive ideologies and calling it aid will not win hearts and minds or improve the development outcomes we seek. While we work to mark up a bipartisan reauthorization of the DFC next month, it is imperative to highlight the priorities that will build trust with our partners, not alienate them. The DFC empowers the U.S. to do both, to advance our strategic interests, but also work with our partners to succeed and thrive. And a critical component of this bipartisan, bicameral legislation will be an equity solution. The United States must ensure that our international development efforts are well coordinated, efficiently implemented, and aligned with the needs of our partners. The DFC unleashes the power of the U.S. private sector and uses its innovative and enterprising spirit to tackle some of the most acute development challenges our partners face. It exemplifies American values, advances U.S. foreign policy interests, and provides a return to American taxpayers through loan repayments and increased economic opportunities around the world. I want to thank our witness and the employees of the DFC for their important work ensuring that the United States remains the partner of choice for the developing world. The chair now recognizes the ranking member, the gentlelady from North Carolina, Mrs. Manning, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to start by thanking our witness, Scott Nathan, for joining us today. This is an important conversation, and your testimony today will help guide this committee's efforts as we look to DFC reauthorization, hopefully as soon as this year. The Development Finance Corporation has been one of our most important development innovations of the last decade, representing a concerted effort by Congress and the executive branch to promote and catalyze inclusive and sustainable economic growth around the world, particularly where it's most urgently needed. This is an investment, not a handout. In fiscal year 22, DFC received $706 million in annual appropriations and returned $359 million based on fees and investments, which shows that DFC is working just as Congress intended. And the return on our investment is not only financial. U.S. development assistance is critical for advancing U.S. foreign policy objectives, especially in terms of our strategic competition with the People's Republic of China. It's no secret that Beijing uses its financial diplomacy and the Belt and Road Initiative to extract natural resources and to harm the environment, lower labor standards, and gain influence for political leverage. Around the world, many nations face a real infrastructure and development gap. According to the World Bank, developing countries need to spend about 4.5% of GDP annually to fund basic improvements in energy, transport, digital, and other sectors. Crying foul isn't enough if China is the only game in town. If we want to compete, the United States must offer a credible alternative, one that does not come with strings attached, but offers innovative, transparent, and values-driven investments. DFC is one of our key tools for demonstrating that the United States is that reliable alternative. However, we can't outcompete China if we are not redoubling our investments in U.S. development assistance. Despite DFC's budget paling in comparison to BRI, Republican proposed budget cuts last fiscal year would have dramatically slashed our development and diplomatic spending. That's not competing. That's throwing in the towel. Nor should we look at DFC solely through the lens of competition with China. A short-sighted focus compromises DFC's ability to leverage financing and harms U.S. credibility. We cannot be seen as a reliable partner if our motivations are viewed only through the prism of some great power competition, or if we only show up when we need something. We must make clear that the United States recognizes there is a mutual benefit to investing in partner nations and that our interest is primarily born of cooperation, not geopolitics. U.S. investments demonstrate U.S. global leadership. As we look to DFC's reauthorization this year, we need to make sure that development remains squarely at the center of its mandate. We also need to make sure DFC can make equity investments, taking an equity stake in projects and not just offering finance in the form of a loan. This is key to getting more projects off the ground. DFC has been hampered by the budgetary treatment of equity, which forces the DFC to reduce its top line on a dollar-for-dollar basis. These investments should be calculated with the understanding that, as I previously noted, they will eventually return money to the U.S. Treasury. We also need to double down on private sector participation in DFC. The U.S. government resources to leverage greater private capital is DFC's principal mechanism, and I look forward to hearing from our witness today on how we can help spur robust private sector engagement. On behalf of Ranking Member Meeks, I thank Chairman McCall and his staff for working in a bipartisan fashion as we approach DFC reauthorization. Promoting economic growth and sustainable development is in all of our shared interests. It's a win for our partnering nations. It's a win for us. I look forward to seeing DFC properly resourced in fiscal year 25, and I hope to see it swiftly reauthorized by both the House and the Senate. Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. I would remind other members of the committee that they can submit an opening statement for the record. We are pleased to have with us the Chief Executive Officer of the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, Mr. Scott Nathan. Thank you for being here with us today. Your full statement will be made part of the record, sir, and I'll ask you to keep your spoken remarks to 5 minutes in order to allow time for member questions. I now recognize Mr. Nathan for his opening statement.
Well, thank you very much, Vice Chair Wagner. Congresswoman Manning, thank you. I also want to thank Chairman McCall and Ranking Member Meeks, as well as all the members of this committee, for giving me the opportunity to discuss what DFC is doing to help meet the challenge of strategic competition, particularly from the PRC in the developing world. I want to thank Congress, and especially this committee, for its continued support of DFC. Since Congress established DFC, you've used the tools you provided us to deliver on the Build Act's mandate to increase development and strategic impact of our investments around the world. DFC financing for the private sector enables reliable access to energy and supports high-quality infrastructure, including safe and secure digital connectivity. We're investing to strengthen health and food systems while also supporting the small businesses that are vital to generating jobs and opportunity. Unlike the development approach of the PRC or our other strategic competitors, DFC's efforts are directed towards supporting private entities, mobilizing private capital, and building resilient market economies. We're guided by the belief that developing a robust private sector is the best way to alleviate poverty over the long term and strengthen the economic and strategic positions of our partners around the world. We need to show up and offer our partners a choice based on our values and on private enterprise, so they don't feel trapped into accepting the offerings of our strategic competitors or authoritarian governments, too much debt and projects that aren't needed or are of poor quality. In the nearly 5 years since Congress created it, DFC has made great progress in this regard. Last year, DFC committed a record $9.3 billion across 132 transactions, nearly double our fiscal year 2020 total. By mobilizing additional private capital, our investments are making an impact, driving economic development where it's needed most, and advancing U.S. strategic interests. We're investing to build roads, ports, airports, and other large-scale infrastructure projects in the developing world. For example, we've committed $553 million to support the construction of a new shipping container terminal in Sri Lanka, a critical transshipment point for the Indian subcontinent, to promote the free flow of goods across key trade routes across the Indo-Pacific and provide economic development to Sri Lanka. DFC is also promoting energy security by helping to diversify Eastern European energy supplies with large-scale projects in Poland, Moldova, Bulgaria, Georgia, and Greece. All these projects have helped the region shift away from dependence on Russian gas. We're focused on securing the critical inputs and supply chains of the industries of the future, investing $150 million in graphite production in Mozambique, $50 million for rare earth oxides in Southern Africa, and almost $1 billion for multiple solar panel manufacturing facilities in India to ensure that no one country or company has a chokehold on price and availability. Wherever we go, DFC works to ensure our projects meet the needs of local communities, from $20 million commitment to cold storage in Africa to our $33 million loan to build grain silos in India. We met our $1 billion food security objective in FY23, years ahead of schedule, and have since doubled our goal. We're investing to improve public health through improvements to local health infrastructure, and at the same time, we're taking steps to boost pandemic preparedness. And we remain committed to helping small businesses get the access to capital they need to thrive, with a focus on ensuring that underrepresented groups benefit from our financing. DFC has active projects in 112 countries, but our primary focus is the world's poorest countries. Last year, nearly 3/4 of our projects were in low or lower middle income countries. At DFC, we see the growing importance of the Indo-Pacific and have tripled our portfolio in the region in the last 3 years. This includes over $4 billion in commitments in India, but also substantial increases in Nepal, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, and others. Africa, however, remains DFC's largest market. With over $11 billion in commitments, DFC has successfully differentiated itself from the predatory practices of the PRC and other competitors, and we're continually on the lookout for further opportunities to work with the private sector in the dozens of countries where we work on the continent. In the Western Hemisphere, DFC sees great potential for partnership, and in Europe, we've continued to respond to Russia's war against Ukraine. To maximize impact, DFC often partners with our peer development finance institutions, and just recently, we've reaffirmed our commitments with our counterparts in South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan. I'm proud of this track record, but I know that DFC can do much more. A high priority, finally, for DFC is working with Congress to pass a reauthorization bill for the agency, and we see this as an opportunity to reaffirm the goals of the BUILD Act and make improvements. We're eager to work with Congress to chart the best path forward for DFC. I look forward to your questions.
I thank you, Mr. Nathan, for your testimony and certainly for your service and your time today. I now will recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. American development agencies work with our partners to achieve self-reliance. That mission respects the dignity, I think, of developing countries and acknowledges that they deserve the power to create a better future for their people. It also starkly contrasts with China's plan to gain influence over our partners through exploitative and coercive investment. Developing countries want and need us to offer an alternative to Chinese capital. But excessive red tape and confusing standards disincentivize our partners to work with us, leaving them vulnerable to China's exploitation. If we are to remain the partner of choice across the developing world, our programming must be efficient, effective, targeted, and responsive. In 2018, Congress created the Development Finance Corporation, the DFC, to better counter China's predatory investment initiatives in the developing world, including the Belt and Road Initiative. It has become clear, however, that the DFC is failing to compete with China in terms of approving projects and getting money out the door quickly. DFC projects can take up to 2 years to be approved and even longer for financing to be dispersed. Mr. Nathan, speed is of the essence for our partners. How are you working to speed up this process? As we approach the DFC's reauthorization, what reforms should Congress consider to resolve bottlenecks?
Thank you very much for the question. I completely agree with you that we need to be faster, more responsive. We're taking the demand signal from the private sector. That's led to success so far. We've more than doubled the amount of activity we do in a single year over the course of just 4 years at DFC, but we need to do more. Some of that means we need more resources to make sure that we have the teams to originate deals, process deals, monitor them on an ongoing basis. And we've done that by building our team. It's why we're putting in front of Congress a request for just over $1 billion of appropriation for fiscal year 25 so that we can continue to build our team.
And reforms?
And in terms of reforms, one of the things that we've accomplished over the last year is a realignment of the way our deal teams were arranged. Previously, they were arranged by deal size or product type that made doing proactive outreach and business development and developing strategies in each different economic sector more challenging. We went through that process, and we continue to work to make sure that we're being as responsive as possible to the private sector partners that we work with.
Last week, I joined my fellow co-chairs of the Pacific Island Caucus for a roundtable with Pacific Island ambassadors. And as we discussed there, the Pacific Islands are in dire need of investment for projects and infrastructure. And China is actively working to fold these strategically important nations into the Belt and Road Initiative. Mr. Nathan, how is the DFC working with the private sector to fund Pacific Island projects? Is there sufficient interest from private sector partners to meet the demand for projects in the region?
So the Pacific Island nations are a priority for us. We were able to do a deal last year by supporting an Australian company that purchased the telecom assets in Papua New Guinea and 5 other Pacific Island nations. We worked with our Japanese counterparts on that project as well. It was a good example of cooperation between Australia, Japan, and the United States. But we need to do more. The challenge in these countries is twofold. These are very small economies, often state-dominated, so finding private partners to work with is challenging. And secondly, we're often restricted from working in certain countries because of their income classification level. Many small island nations, because of the way that the calculation works, are classified as high-income countries, and as a result, we're not eligible to work there.
In my limited time, I wanted to say that over a third of China's Belt and Road infrastructure projects have encountered major implementation problems, such as corruption, and scandals, labor violations, and environmental hazards. I want to know, how are you exposing the pitfalls of working with China versus the United States? And are these arguments effective in convincing developing countries to reject exploitative Belt and Road projects and work with the United States instead? And please give us a specific example, perhaps in writing, given the fact my time's about over.
Just then briefly, I'll comment that we get a very strong demand signal. When I travel, leaders in Africa, Latin America, the Indo-Pacific are interested in diversifying their economic relationships, are interested in working with U.S. companies, and are interested in receiving finance from DFC. They appreciate the high standards and the appropriateness for local laws and conditions. We don't bring in our own workers. We use local workers in the projects that we work on, and we're focused on quality and standards.
Well, my time has expired. If you could give me some specific examples in writing, Mr. Nathan, I would greatly appreciate it. I am now pleased to recognize Ms. Manning for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you again, Mr. Nathan, for being with us today. I am very concerned about our adversaries' attempts to dominate the next generation of critical technology. As you know, Chinese state-owned and backed companies like Huawei and ZTE construct 5G towers and deploy LEO satellites in many countries, which pose risks to our sensitive data and threatens our security. That's why I introduced a bipartisan bill with my friend Congresswoman Young Kim, the Securing Global Telecommunications Act, which would require a comprehensive strategy for securing global telecommunications infrastructure worldwide, incorporating mobile networks, data centers, and emerging technologies like LEO satellites and 6G. So, Mr. Nathan, can you share more about how DFC currently works with our allies and our partners to help finance secure networks and trusted telecommunications vendors?
Well, I completely agree with you that finding safe, secure platforms for digital upgrades is a key element of our strategy. I mentioned one of our projects in the Pacific, in Papua New Guinea and 5 Pacific Island nations. That was working with Japan and Australia to secure those assets of critical strategic importance to the Australians, and we wanted to support that effort. In Africa, we've made a $300 million loan to Africa Data Centers, which does landing stations from subsea cables, and then data centers they've been building out throughout the continent with the support of our finance. This is critical to make sure that's on an open architecture, secure platform. We're also working with cellular telephone companies. It's important in order to lay the groundwork for 5G and even the 6G upgrades that you mentioned to make sure that we have partners in place for 2 and 3G who can make sure to then build on that when they upgrade. That, you know, we're talking about in some of the countries where we work where they're still in 2 and 3G. So it's important to be able to establish those relationships now so that the upgrade can be on the kind of technology platforms that you mentioned that are safe and secure.
Thank you. The CHIPS and Science Act is already helping onshore semiconductor manufacturing and helping to bolster our supply chain. But to maximize its impact, we also need to harness better human capital and access to critical minerals. What is DFC's role in strengthening supply chains and securing raw materials we need to be able to compete with China?
Making sure that we have secured the inputs that will go into the industries of the future, where the economic competition of the future will be, is a key priority for DFC. Last year, and I mentioned this in my testimony, we were able to do several deals to help secure critical minerals. In Mozambique, we made a $150 million loan for the production of graphite. We support, through our equity investment, a company called TechMet. The United States owns 15% of this company, and it is developing both sources and processing for critical minerals in a Western-facing, high-standard way. There's a project for nickel and cobalt that we help finance in Brazil. There's a rare earth oxides investment that they have made in Southern Africa, and there's more in the pipeline. These are efforts that are very critical for us to make sure that the inputs of these industries of the future are safe and secure and are not being manipulated.
Thank you. And I note of all the regions in which DFC is active, the MENA region, Middle East and North Africa, makes up the smallest share of DFC's investments. I'd love to hear about what opportunities might exist to grow this portion of the portfolio and how we can leverage DFC to strengthen very important goals in that area, like regional normalization.
So I'm glad you mentioned that. Part of our overseas expansion plan is to have a DFC employee in Morocco, specifically to address the goal that you mentioned. It helps with deal sourcing, relationship building, business development, supporting particularly cross-border investments. It would be great if we were able to find an Israeli company that was working, say, on an infrastructure project for water in Morocco. We've been having conversations like that, and I think it would support the goals that you mentioned.
What are the biggest hurdles to, I'm sorry, my time is expiring. I yield back.
Certainly submit
I'll
questions.
be happy to. Thank you.
For the witness to respond in writing.
Thank you.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Nathan, for your testimony and leadership. I have a couple of questions. One is on cobalt. I've chaired 2 congressional hearings on the mining of cobalt out of the DR Congo, where 25 to 40,000 young people are exploited. Child labor is absolutely rampant. And about 200,000 adults, all under the, pretty much all under the Chinese dictatorship's direction. All of it is sent, as you probably know, to PRC, where it is processed. And, we're trying to say, if you want to drive an EV, fine, but don't do it on the backs of slave labor and child labor. And I understand that, but I haven't been able to confirm it, and hopefully you could say one way or the other. In 2022, A proposal was put to the DFC with regards to processing cobalt in Tanzania from the DRC or elsewhere in Africa, so to avoid, again, it going to the PRC, and they also gives them the monopolization of that commodity as well. Can you confirm that there was such a proposal, and was it rejected? Is it being looked at now?
We can get back to you on that. I'm unfamiliar with the proposal that you mentioned. We did do a cobalt and nickel deal in Brazil, however.
Right. But no, I'm talking about China, just,
Yeah.
could you get back to us on that?
Yeah, for sure. And I should maybe just to give context, we are very focused on finding ways that we can help secure supplies of critical minerals. Mining deals, as you point out, are challenging, however, particularly in some of the markets where we operate from a standards point of view, labor standards, environmental standards, social displacement standards.
Right.
These are, we can't compromise our standards while trying to find the opportunities to secure the materials that you're mentioning.
Right. But in a way, we have no idea, once it's sent to China,
100% agree with that.
who has
Yeah.
access to those.
Yeah,
I just had a
100%
hearing
agree.
last week on the China Commission, which I chair, about the so-called auditors who go over there and they come back with these bogus positive assessments about the labor, lack of labor, which is lack of labor rights. And it's one big falsehood. I mean, so obviously, anyone trying to say what's happening in the DR Congo, more so once it goes to China, they're not going to have any clue as to what's really going on inside that processing plant. Let me just ask you, turn to the Horn of Africa, another BRI country. Djibouti is among the countries most indebted to the PRC and hosts a People's Liberation Army base there, as we all know. At the end of April, a Tory MP, Tom Loughton, who, like me, is sanctioned by China, was detained for more than 7 hours at the airport in Djibouti and then expelled from the country. He had entered Djibouti from Somaliland, a de facto independent country with close unofficial ties with Taiwan, which therefore has been targeted by the CCP and was probably an exacerbating factor. Significant lithium deposits have recently been discovered in Somaliland, which I understand a Taiwanese firm is interested in investing in. Lithium is another metal, as of course we all know, that's needed for EV batteries. Given, among other things, that the DFC is partnering with Taiwan's Development Finance Corporation, the need to provide a counterexample to China's onerous debt trap policy in the Horn of Africa, the importance of encouraging countries to cooperate with Taiwan, and the strategic location in Somalia especially, with an excellent port in Berbera, would DFC consider investing in a project to extract and process lithium from Somaliland, perhaps in partnership with Taiwan?
We would certainly be open to talking to whatever private sector developer is interested in that project or similar projects elsewhere. As you point out, we have recently signed a compact with our counterpart in Taiwan. It's important that we work together to find ways to cooperate. We find those kind of partnerships can be very fruitful in working with like-minded development finance institutions where we share similar goals to find interesting projects around the world.
Thank you. One last brief question. What, if anything, is DFC doing to promote American infrastructure projects through the lens of safe and fair labor?
Sorry, American infrastructure project?
Yes, that might have a foreign component to it to ensure that those products or that which feeds into the infrastructure, steel, whatever it might be, is free of, okay, I'm out of time.
Yeah, well, we're very interested in finding high-quality, high-standard infrastructure projects in all the markets where we work.
Any more you can elaborate on, I would ask you to do it in writing. The gentleman's time has expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Berra, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you, Mr. Nathan, for being here. You touched on the port project that DFC is investing in Sri Lanka, and if we turn the clock back to 2014 when the PRC came out with their signature project in the Belt and Road Initiative, building a new port city in Sri Lanka. We've seen the debt that Sri Lanka has incurred, what I have in front of me is 1.4 billion in debt, which I think has actually grown much further beyond that. And progress in that port has been slow. I was in Sri Lanka in early 2020, before everything shut down in the pandemic, and certainly saw some of the pressures directly on their economy. And then subsequently, we've seen the economic challenge that Sri Lanka's faced in terms of trying to restructure debt and the like. Contrast that with the DFC's announced $553 million investment in the nearby West Container Terminal, which you referenced in your opening comments. Could you, contrast these two projects, and how does the development of the West Container Terminal enhance Sri Lanka's status and contribute to its GDP?
Thanks very much for the question. So as you mentioned, the port of Hambantota, which was developed by China Merchant with Chinese financing, when Sri Lanka fell into macroeconomic trouble, that status of that port was changed to a 99-year lease, and there was a great deal of controversy surrounding that. Unlike that project, the project in the Western Container Terminal of the Port of Colombo that we've supported with the $553 million of financing supports a private developer from India, along with a developer from Sri Lanka, the biggest conglomerate in Sri Lanka, to develop that port. It's currently on time. It's actually ahead of schedule and on budget. When this port is completed, it will be able to handle over 3 million TEU a year. If you look on the map where Sri Lanka is located between the Straits of Malacca and the Suez Canal, the strategic position of Sri Lanka is incredibly important for the free flow of trade and goods, which is clearly in the strategic interests of the United States and our allies and partners. It's of great importance to India as well, because India lacks a deep water port for a container terminal. So Sri Lanka, the vast majority of the shipping that goes through Sri Lanka is for transshipment to the Indian subcontinent. This creates strategic vulnerability and is very important to India, so we're able to support Indian efforts by developing this port. And finally, this port will create a huge amount of economic activity and jobs in Sri Lanka, high-quality jobs for people there to help stabilize the economy and support economic growth for the long term, which is clearly in our interest.
Great. And that is very much in contrast with the Hambantota port and the problems that port created. So that is a warning sign. And as we talk to smaller countries around the world, where we've seen other countries get into a debt trap as well, just to be very careful and look at all your options. Switching, more recently in August 2023. During the Camp David summit with the United States, Japan, and Korea, I believe there was a trilateral MOU signed between the DFC as well as the Japan Bank of International Cooperation and the Korea Export-Import Bank. Can you touch on how we collaborate with some of our partner and valued allies in the world to leverage each country's development capabilities?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the goals that Congress had in the BUILD Act was to put the DFC in a better position than its predecessor to be a good partner to like-minded development finance institutions. It enables us to share deal flow, to help leverage our due diligence efforts, to work together for greater impact. So the trilateral partnership you mentioned between KEXIM, JBIC, and DFC is important because of the relationship we have with those two strategic partners, but also it will help promote work where we're really interested in increasing our game, the Indo-Pacific.
Great.
We have similar partnership with Australia, one with Singapore, one with Taiwan. These are critical.
Great. My time has expired.
The gentleman yields back, and the chair now recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mr. Nathan, thanks for being here. President Biden, his anti-reliable fuel agenda, in my opinion, has led to a spiked energy price across much of the developing African countries. Farmers can't afford low-cost fertilizer, and countries that are endowed with great natural resources are not encouraged to use them, but rather forced to adopt far-reaching green energy projects. I don't know if you realize it or not, that these countries could likely help themselves climb out of poverty by providing their citizens with already existing, clean, affordable, and readily available fuel. And I think that PRC sees an opportunity here where we refuse to. Your agency chooses to do one of two things, it seems to me. They make one-sided green deals with these countries, which sends them to permanent state of poverty and a long-term dependency on foreign aid handouts, likely from us. Or you allow the PRC to close all energy development deals related to diesel, coal, and petroleum because we don't engage in them. That having been said, in FY '23 or '24, were any of the DFC's funds used to contribute to the so-called Palestinian economy?
Would you like me to address the first point, or about?
Well, you can,
Africa?
sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. Because in the last year, we did a fertilizer deal in Nigeria for the production of fertilizer called Indorama, which I think is very important for meeting the local needs through the production of fertilizer in West Africa. And just last month, our board approved a $412 million deal in Sierra Leone for gas-fired power generation that will be critical for providing reliable access to a country that has amongst the lowest electricity penetration rate in the world.
Well, I
in
think
Sierra
that's
Leone.
awesome, and what I'd like to do, since you offered it, is see of the $1 billion plus budget that you have, the percentage of your budget used for traditional energy sources and traditional fertilizer sources. But that having been said, do you have an answer to the other question regarding your FY '23 and '24 spending?
Yes, so I believe under the Nita Lowey Middle East Partnership for Peace Act, we have provided $3.5 million to projects in the West Bank under that $50 million a year program. We also have previously had some projects with financial institutions that provide finance to small business in the West Bank, and we continue to look at future projects, but that's the extent of.
Are you familiar with the Ritz Leasing Project, an initiative to support EV transport and related charging infrastructure in the West Bank?
Yes, so that's a $10 million project that hasn't yet dispersed, but yes.
So many of us, myself included, would consider this in support to some extent of the terrorist organization known as Hamas and other terrorist organizations, including Islamic Jihad, that operate in and around in governance in the West Bank and Gaza. That having been said, can you remind me, how does funding EV charging stations in the West Bank or Gaza help your organization combat the Belt and Road Initiative?
So the purpose of the investments under the MEPA law, under the Nita Lowey MEPA law, is to provide economic opportunity to keep people employed and to promote economic growth and stability in the West Bank, particularly given the financial trouble.
But they're
that
running
they've
it
had right
through your organization, and I thought your organization in large part was meant to combat the PRC's Belt and Road Initiative. Is that a competitive location for the United States?
You know, the mandate that Congress gave us under the BUILD Act was to do economic development and advance the strategic and foreign policy interests of the United States. So I think doing economic development in the West Bank in this circumstance fulfills our mandate. I also want to address the point that you raised about terrorist groups. It's incredibly important for us to make sure that our partners are vetted, that we do know your customer kind of analysis, and that vetting takes place to make sure that our counterparts don't have anything to do with what you mentioned.
I hope that's true, Madam Chair. My time's expired. I yield.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Castro, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Nathan, thank you so much for your work at the DFC and for your work promoting the United States and development around the world. This question concerns how you coordinate with other U.S. government agencies such as USAID. USAID often identifies particularly promising ways to conduct development assistance, such as through programs like Development Innovation Ventures and the Office of the Chief Economist. So when USAID identifies such an effective approach to development assistance, does DFC have established mechanisms to invest in those approaches?
So we work very closely with USAID. We work closely with aid missions on the ground, who are often the source of deal flow, particularly for some of our smaller transactions that address small business. We have our mission transaction unit, which is the sort of financing window for USAID projects that's within DFC. USAID is the vice chair of our board. The administrative power is the vice chair of our board. And I think we have an extremely productive working relationship.
Have you engaged in joint projects with them, such as where DFC supports the project through loans, loan guarantees, or equity, and USAID provides grant assistance through a blended finance approach?
Absolutely. And it's not only that we've worked on those projects together, they're often sourced by USAID personnel.
Oh, very good. In the last year, kind of switching gears, but in the last year, how much of DFC's financing went to countries in upper middle income countries?
We can get you the exact number. I think it was about 25% of overall projects committed and about, I have it here, 43.2% of the total dollars.
And I ask the question because people often make the claim that the DFC finds it difficult to work in upper middle income countries and that we must make it easier for the DFC to work in these countries. And I just want to push back against that a bit. It seems it's easy enough for the DFC to work in these countries, and it's important that the DFC prioritizes low and lower middle income countries where the needs are most dire.
Yeah, so what I would say about that is last year, 75% of our overall projects by number were in low income and lower middle income countries. But those deals are often smaller in size. So when you begin to look at by dollar amount, the dollar amount comes down as a proportion.
And when you work in upper middle income countries, which tend to have access to large capital markets and are not necessarily in need of finance from the U.S. government, how do you take into consideration the potential for the project to mobilize private capital towards development goals?
Well, that's an important criteria actually in all of our projects to make sure that mobilization of private capital is conducted through the work that we do with the private companies that we support.
And of course, the DNC is first and foremost a U.S. international development institution, and the BUILD Act of 2018 is clear about the DFC's development mandate. As we consider the reauthorization of the BUILD Act, which expires next year, I believe that it's essential that we defend and strengthen the agency's development mandate. I fear that if this agency simply becomes a bank to execute the foreign policy priorities of the United States, the bipartisan coalition that supports the DFC will splinter. And so how are you ensuring that the DFC remains first and foremost an international development organization?
Well, if you look across our 132 transactions last year, there's a wide range of projects, from some of the projects we've just been discussing, the large-scale infrastructure, highly strategic projects, which also have huge development impact, to a large number of projects that are under $10 million, which have a significant impact for smallholder farmers or small business people that make a difference in terms of generating employment and making economic impact. I think we can have the broad approach across the whole portfolio. One doesn't take away from the other.
Sure.
And I'd finally say that good development policy is good foreign and national security policy. It serves the interests of the United States to see our allies and partners have economic growth and stability as a result.
Sure, thank you. And there is one issue I'd like to raise to the committee on this topic. When the DFC was created, the BUILD Act of 2018 created a dedicated office of the Inspector General for the DFC. Unfortunately, unlike almost all U.S. other inspectors general, the DFC's Office of the Inspector General was not provided law enforcement authority through statute or delegation of authority from the Attorney General. This has seriously affected the OIG's efforts to conduct necessary oversight over the DFC and its activities over the years. And for the last two Congresses, I've introduced the Enhancing Development Finance Corporation Oversight Act with Mr. Fitzpatrick to extend such law enforcement authority to the Office of the Inspector General. I hope that the chairman and the committee will work with me to advance this legislation. May I yield back?
Gentleman yields back. I'm sure we'll be taking that up during reauthorization next year, Mr. Castro. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Mast, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Just a simple question. What countries are your highest priority to work in?
You know, we don't have a single country like that, but we're making a large effort to increase our efforts in the Indo-Pacific. I mentioned that our total exposure in the Indo-Pacific has tripled in the last 2 years. I think that's an area of high strategic and developmental importance. But at the same time, you know, we're looking to strengthen countries that have democracies that can show that their governments are delivering for their people through making sure that there's a strong level of economic activity in those countries. That's several countries in sub-Saharan Africa. We recently did a deal in Malawi that served
Which ones
that
in
interest.
sub-Saharan Africa?
Malawi is the country I just mentioned where we recently did an energy deal that showed that they were delivering. We're looking at quite a few projects. I mean, last year we did deals in 26 countries in Africa. So
Which ones in the Pacific?
which ones in the Pacific? So I mentioned Sri Lanka. That was an important deal that we did last year. India is our largest exposure in the Indo-Pacific. We would like to do more in the Philippines and Indonesia. We continue to try to build out our deal flow in Vietnam.
What do you assess India most needs from America?
You know, so the area that we have had the greatest success recently in India is in supply chain diversification. There's an enormous demand in India for energy diversification, for solar panels. So we've done 2 deals, close to $1 billion for solar panel manufacturing in India.
When you say there's enormous demand, who asks for it? Who comes to you and says, hey, DFC, we really think we need America to provide this. Who makes that request to you?
So it's 2 sources. One is when we meet with government officials and diplomatic officials, they're looking for diversification of relationships. They don't want to be dependent on one country for their source of finance. But the primary demand signal that we get for our projects is from the private sector, from companies. We're only funding private entities to begin with. So if we don't get applications from companies, if we don't have deal flow where we've developed through our proactive business development or through our interagency partners or through other means of developing deal flow, there's really nothing for us to do. We need to have prospects with private companies that are looking for financing in order to fill whatever financing gap that they have.
And you spoke a little earlier about know your customer, know your client.
Yeah.
Do you think of that in kind of the strict banking sense of that term, in knowing who you're investing with, what is their credit worthiness, you know, what are the current outlays of debt to income that they currently have to make sure that you're investing in companies that are going to be solvent in 6 months, 12 months, however many quarters down the road?
Absolutely. There's two components to that. First is financial viability. We're absolutely doing the financial analysis and due diligence necessary to make sure that projects are commercial and viable in that sense. But the know your customer, anti-money laundering, counterparty vetting work that we do, I would say goes beyond what happens in a commercial context. It's very similar, but we also have access to all the resources of the United States government, including terrorist watch lists, the OFAC lists at Treasury. We need to be able to take advantage of all of the resources of the United States government to make sure that we know as much as possible about our counterparties in the private sector. It's really an advantage of being part of the U.S. government. We cooperate also with our counterparties, to other DFIs, to make sure that we know as much as possible
Give me a
about the
couple
private
of your biggest success stories of companies. Could be in sub-Saharan Africa, could be in the Pacific. Give me a couple of the biggest failures.
So in terms of successes in the last year, I'm very proud of the graphite deal that we mentioned. That's a new direction. Those are challenging deals to do. I'm very proud of, in Ecuador, we were able to provide $150 million for the build out of a port called Porto Bolivar. There's a very high development and strategic importance in that deal. The deal I mentioned in Sri Lanka is a great example of that.
Any failing companies?
You know, I'm fortunate that in the 2 years that I've been in this role, I can't think of any material failures, but we'll get back to you in writing on that if you'd like.
I would appreciate it if you do. Thank you.
Chair recognizes Congressman
Stanton from
Stanton.
Arizona.
You're
My
not
good friend from
speaking.
Arizona.
Sorry, Mr. Nathan, I just got put back in my chair and I can't hear who the next member is. Anyway.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member, for holding this important hearing. Mr. Nathan, thank you for being here today. I am enthusiastic about the Development Finance Corporation's investments in projects that promote U.S. foreign policy interests, improve national security, and provide development assistance to countries that need it. I'm a member of the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee and a representative of the border state of Arizona. I see opportunity for DFC to pursue each of its missions in Latin America more than it currently does. While DFC mostly invests in lower and middle income countries, many Latin American countries are classified as upper income or even upper income countries by the World Bank. Upper middle income or upper income. This classification limits DFC's investment ability, even if development projects could help the low-income populations in those countries and help address root causes of migration. Mr. Nathan, how do income category limit DFC's ability to invest in Latin America and the Caribbean, especially since countries may be classified as upper middle income without accounting for high cost of living or severe wealth stratification?
You're exactly right. So Latin America is a high priority for us. It's currently about 1/4 of our portfolio overall. We did more than $1 billion of activity there last year, but this issue related to income classification is a challenge. The majority of countries in Latin America and the Caribbean are upper middle income or high income, and in high income countries, we can't work at all. An example of that is Panama. That's a country where we would like to be able to pursue deals, but we can't because of the income classification. In our reauthorization, we're hoping that this issue will be addressed. To my knowledge, we're the only development finance institution that uses the World Bank income classification categories. The World Bank doesn't even use them as the way to determine lending eligibility. They have a more multi-factored approach. We would like to use that approach, which I think will broaden out and increase our ability to do projects in Latin America, the Caribbean, the Pacific Island nations.
I think it's a great point, particularly with regard to semiconductor. National security is definitely involved in nearshoring of the semiconductor industry, and we could use your resources, your expertise in that arena in Central Latin America. In 2019, Congress expanded DFC's mandate through the European Energy Security and Diversification Act, allowing DFC to invest in energy projects in upper-income countries in Eastern Europe. It looks like this has led to many of DFC's largest projects and has seemingly created alternatives to Russian energy in that part of the world. Mr. Nathan, was Congress' expansion of DFC mandate helpful in furthering DFC's ability to improve national security? For example, would you consider DFC's investments in Eastern Europe a successful expansion of your work?
I would. It was also very timely, given February 24th, 2022, and Russia's outrageous aggression against Ukraine. The pressure that put on Central Europe to diversify very rapidly their energy sources in order to not go cold, not go dark in the next year, that enabled us to really help, whether it was with the hedging issues in Poland for the purchases of LNG, whether it was Moldova, a country that's under great threat from what's happening in Ukraine. We were able to provide $400 million of political risk insurance to help them diversify from Gazprom. We also had projects in Romania, Greece, and elsewhere. So this, I think it was a great success.
I agree with you, and I think that could be a possible model to look at in your reauthorization as we look at upper middle income countries in Central Latin America for purposes of nearshoring strategy as a way to help us win the competition with China. It's important that DFC have the flexibility to invest in Latin America in order to counter China's investments in that region. We need to play to our strength to deliver financially and environmentally sustainable development that lifts up communities and facilitates trade investments with the U.S. What are some strategies that have worked in gaining a competitive edge over PRC-linked entities in the investment and financing space?
So we're very focused on high standards. I think that's a good contrast. We're very focused on the private sector, particularly, as you mentioned, in the financing space, helping small and medium enterprises. In the last year, I believe our financing helped 500,000 small businesses around the world. That kind of support for entrepreneurship and the private sector, the power of the private sector, is just a sharp contrast to what our strategic competitors do.
I really appreciate it. Look forward to that reauthorization coming up soon. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now acknowledge myself for 5 minutes. First, let me say you have a big job, I think, to counter primarily our adversaries. I know in 2018 we passed the BUILD Act, Development Finance Corporation, with an eye towards countering the Belt and Road Initiative primarily. And equity, as you know, sir, has been an issue since the inception of when the BUILD Act was passed. OMB has basically said any equity deal that the DFC does is considered a loss, treating equity on a dollar-for-dollar basis. Our intent back then was that it be treated on a net present value basis, not dollar for dollar. We couldn't resolve this in the last administration, although I tried with Mick Mulvaney at OMB. He was very stubborn about it, although a dear friend. But in fact, last month, Administrator Power told us that a compromise is still being worked with OMB. I'm not so sure. Do you believe that it is possible to work with the OMB to get to treat equity on a net present value?
Well, I believe that OMB supports the proposal to create an equity fix. There's always a question around exactly the details of the proposal and what the language should be for that. But OMB, the whole administration, supports an equity fix. I think it requires an act of Congress, however. And I know there's been some legislation proposed, whether it gets addressed separately before reauthorization or in reauthorization. I think this is just critical. If you look at our $9.3 billion of activity of deals last year, 500 million of it roughly was equity. That cost $500 million of appropriation, as if it were a grant. Right. The other 8.8 billion of transactions required only 110 million of appropriation. There's great bang for the buck for the US taxpayer in that. Somewhere in between dollar for dollar and the kind of high leverage ratio on the rest of our portfolio has got to be the solution. That will give us a lot more opportunity to make a difference with equity early in projects, to have influence, to be more forward-leaning on risk, and really make the kind of impact that Congress intended.
I completely agree, and I think that you and I have talked about this. I mean, I think it's a fix that's necessary to, if you factor in the return on the investment, and that's not how the current process is being scored by OMB, we will continue to try to work with them and you and the administration. We are considering an idea of setting up a separate corporate capital account for equity, not tied to the DFC's maximum contingent liability, that would potentially allow more equity deals to be pursued. Do you have any thoughts on that idea? That would actually circumvent both the OMB and also the budget committees if they were not willing to come to a fix.
Well, we're very interested in working with you and your team as closely as possible to make this happen. It's long overdue to have a fix. the idea that somehow we're going to lose 100 cents of every dollar that we're currently investing. I'm not saying that DFC is going to be the best equity investor ever, but there's no way that we're going to lose 100 cents on every dollar, and that's the way it's accounted for now. That makes no sense whatsoever. So we need to find a pathway to fix this and fix it as soon as possible.
I think it's key. It'll give you a lot more power and investments, I think, and you'll have more private investors coming to you, as a result of that. So, well, I look forward to working with you on that, and I appreciate the work you're doing.
Thank you.
Chair recognizes Mr. Ramo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Nathan, for being here. The U.S. International Development Finance Corporation's annual report details the ongoing work to support Ukraine's economic resilience as it defends itself from Russia's unlawful invasion. This report recognizes our government's commitment to using every available economic tool to attract private capital and support small and medium-sized businesses in Ukraine. You yourself, Mr. Nathan, have traveled to Ukraine several times since the Russian invasion to work with the local business community. I want to express my appreciation for your work to ensure that the $1.1 billion invested by the DFC is used effectively, as effectively as possible to support Ukraine's economy. But I'm also sure you would agree that more must be done to support our ally and help them prepare for the post-war recovery. The recently enacted Ukraine Security Supplemental Appropriations Act that I proudly voted for authorizes the DFC to use funds for economic support for Ukraine. I know you spoke a little bit about the energy sector now, but I'd love to hear a little bit about how the DFC plans on using the funds provided by Congress to increase private investments in Ukraine and bolster Ukraine's economy.
Well, you're exactly right. This is a high priority for us, and we're not waiting for some future date of reconstruction or recovery. We're focused now on helping the private sector. It helps keep people employed. It means businesses are paying taxes there. It helps produce the material necessary for the war that the Ukrainians are fighting for their survival and independence. We're doing this through support for some financial institutions, some existing and some new clients for us. By providing financial assistance to banks that can then on-lend to their customers. This keeps economic activity today going, which helps lessen the need for future recovery efforts. We're also focused on the agribusiness sector. This is a very important element of Ukraine's economy, and it has implications developmentally for the world in terms of supplying the food necessary to provide food security throughout the globe. So this is, for example, we made a $250 million deal with a chicken processing company called MHP, which is the largest chicken processor in Europe and is very important for providing food security in both Ukraine and beyond. And we're looking at many other deals using our risk mitigation tools like political risk insurance to help support the agricultural sector. We're also looking to provide political risk insurance to help. For example, we worked on a clinic called Superhumans, which is helping for amputees who were wounded in the war. And our political risk insurance helps the investment that's going into building this clinic. We have other insurance deals that can help build the economic infrastructure of Ukraine by making sure there's insurance available for businesses that are looking to invest and grow. So I could go on, but this is a huge area of priority for us and a personal commitment from me as well.
Thank you for those efforts. I want to shift gears slightly and try to squeeze another question in, but we know that the People's Republic of China Belt and Road Initiative is, operating in mass economic coercion, and we know its impact on the African continent, and it's really, been such a big presence in nearly every country in Africa receiving loans under this initiative. For example, in the country where my dad was born in Ghana, the Belt and Road Initiative has already provided about $2 billion in coercive loans for infrastructure projects. And now China is Ghana's largest creditor. And public opinion in Ghana is turning on the Belt and Road Initiative. I'd be interested in how the DFC can work to support countries like Ghana, so, models of governance to help end their reliance on the loans from the Belt and Road Initiative?
Well, we need to keep upping our game. Last year, we did 46 transactions in Africa for over $2 billion in value, and I'm confident that this year we're going to do even more. We have some great projects in the works in Africa. There is a strong demand signal for higher quality, more appropriate, more respectful financing and project development throughout Africa. When I meet with African leaders, they're looking to diversify their relationships, have new partnerships, extend friendship beyond what they have now. But it's incumbent on us to show up. That's what the DFC is all about. That's what this administration is making great efforts to make sure that our African partners know that we're interested in not just helping them, but working with them and partnering with them through business. I think that's the best way to do that, and that's what DFC is all about.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes Ms. Kim.
Thank you, Chairman, for holding today's hearing on Development Finance Corporation. Thank you, Mr. Nathan, for joining us. Good to see you again.
Yeah, nice to see you.
Yeah. Ensuring the U.S. can effectively counter the CCP's malign influence abroad, in especially the developing countries, is a very, very high priority for me. And I view DFC as the self-powered tool to do just that. So in our meetings and our correspondence and conversations before, I've expressed my appreciation for the work that you're doing. However, the reality today is that we have a very large national debt and budget deficit. So I believe we need to be creative in development programming to ensure the sustainability of our development initiative and to effectively compete with the CCP in that space. We need to work more closely with private sector, which we know private-public sector partnership would be the key for the success of DFC, and DFC is a critical tool for accomplishing that. One of the most effective ways to counter Belt and Road Initiative is to highlight the difference in quality between the CCP's poorly built and exploitative projects and higher quality guarantees that U.S. investment brings. So could you tell me how DFC can ensure that its investments are marketed as part of the wider U.S. government efforts in the host country?
Yes, thank you for the question and for our previous conversations as well. I think it's important that we be proud of what we're offering, not step back from high standards, not step back from the nature and the values of what we're projecting through what we offer. By being respectful for local laws and conditions, by employing people locally rather than bringing in workers, by thinking about long-term value as opposed to short-term wins, by finding private sector partners and funding projects that are commercially viable and financially sustainable. I think we're strongly differentiating ourselves, and I think we're beginning to make a difference. Along with our partners in the G7 and other like-minded allies and partners, we need to make sure to work together to really make clear that we're offering an alternative.
So how will the increased number of overseas DFC officers help market the corporation's investments and projects on the ground?
Yeah. So it turns out that DFC is massively underrepresented abroad. Most development finance institutions have somewhere between 15 and 30 or even more % of their staff overseas. We have 1%. We have 6 direct hires. We're expanding that, and we're working with you and your colleagues to do that.
Yeah.
But we need to double or triple that to get to 3%. And these people disproportionately carry their weight in business development by having local relationships, contacts on the ground, and doing business development. They really help fill our deal pipeline. And as you point out, they then also, because of their local presence and relationships, can be part of the overall effort of giving visibility and publicity to the work we do.
Sure.
Of course, we work with with our embassies and other parts of the interagency to help do this. But there's really no substitute for having our own employees do that.
Thank you. So can you talk about the efforts or additional efforts we're taking to help countries who are dependent on China's Belt and Road Initiative? And can you give some examples of some of the projects that make countries less reliant on Chinese infrastructure projects?
Yeah. So I mentioned the project in Sri Lanka. I think there's a direct contrast there in the Port of Colombo. The project that we've financed through the private sector with an Indian and Sri Lankan company is immediately adjacent to China Maritime's port. And I think our port is going to be highly competitive with them. But there are other projects where we've directly encountered potential Chinese competition. For example, in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, we made a $267 million loan for a project called Smart Rio, which was competing against two different Chinese competitors for the tender. It helps manage lighting and sewer systems and water in Rio. Those kind of infrastructure projects are incredibly important. In Turkey, we provided financing for a polypropylene plant last year called Ceyhan. This project had not only a potential Chinese competitor, but also a Russian competitor, and we were very pleased to be able to support the private sector company that developed that with U.S. financing.
Thank you very much. My time's up, so I'll yield back. Thank you,
Anyway,
Chairman.
yields. Chair recognizes Mr. Phyllis McCormick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Nathan, last December, President Biden hosted nearly 50 African leaders for a 3-day summit in Washington. During the meeting, the administration committed to investing at least $55 billion in Africa over the next 3 years, including private sector initiatives, or more than $15 billion. By September 30th of 2023, Sub-Saharan Africa accounted for $10.5 billion of DFC's $41.4 billion in activity portfolio. That's a great step forward, and I commend you guys on that. But when it comes to one of the most important issues on the administration's agenda, climate change and the transition to a green economy, Africa is missing. As a result, the United States is foregoing an opportunity to, 1, deepen commercial ties with the continent, 2, partner with African nations to strengthen supply and production chains, and 3, help Africa diversify away from its reliance on China for more than 50% of its 26 critical minerals. This message is implicit in the Inflation Reduction Act, which was signed into law last August. One of the act's key provisions is a tax credit that is available to American consumers who purchase electric vehicles whose battery contain a certain percentage of critical minerals that have been extracted or processed in the United States or in any country with which the United States have free trade agreements. Here's my question. Many African countries are rich with critical minerals. Do you believe we should extend these tax incentives to companies sourcing their minerals from any African nations?
You know, that's pretty far off my remit as the leader of a development finance institution. What I will say is we're working on critical minerals, whether those tax incentives exist or not, and trying to make sure, whether it's in Mozambique or in South Africa or elsewhere in Southern Africa, that we're doing what we can to help support the development and even processing of critical minerals. I did want to mention also, you mentioned the Africa Leader Summit. We were proud to be able to announce $369 million of projects as part of that, and subsequently we've done another $2 billion of projects in Africa across 46 different transactions. But we need to do more, and it's a big focus for us. The overseas presence that we're trying to build includes many potential new offices in Francophone Africa, in West Africa, in East Africa, in order to increase the ability of DFC to fill our project pipeline with great potential deals.
Well, since Africa is such a huge continent, there's so many different countries, do you believe that we should focus on the beneficiaries of the African Growth and Opportunity Act?
I'm sorry?
Do you believe that we should focus on the beneficiaries of the African Growth and Opportunity Act, since there's no FTA?
Yeah, I mean, again, we work across the whole continent, and issues related to whether there's free trade agreements or tax incentives are the kind of thing that I leave to my colleagues at the Treasury Department and elsewhere. Whether those issues are resolved or not, we will continue to work to find opportunities to fill the financing gap, to make sure that we're looking for infrastructure, energy, healthcare, agribusiness, support for small business kind of projects throughout the whole of Africa in order to make as much development and strategic impact as we can.
Thank you. I yield back.
Generally yields. I just want to make a comment. I think you must be somewhere in the right place because they're saying you're not investing in green energy enough, and we argue that you're not investing in fossil fuels enough in Africa. So you must be doing something right, I think. Chair recognizes Mr. Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Nathan, as you know, natural gas plays a large role in Ukraine's energy sector. Has the DFC provided support to Ukraine's natural gas production and pipeline infrastructure?
So far, we've not had opportunities to do so. The other area that we'd be very interested in energy in Ukraine is helping with the nuclear sector, given that's really one of Ukraine's strong competitive advantages.
So, going to your point, we're having both nuclear and natural gas. What are the next steps that you may be able to do and to provide that type of assistance in a predictable way?
Well, you know, we are in discussions with the electric utility of Ukraine to see if there's ways that we can help them. Of course, the challenge for us is that we're looking for private sector partners. The utility is a state-owned partner, but there's often opportunities to develop power generation projects where the state-owned utility is an off-taker and we wouldn't have to face them directly. But we've been working closely with them because Ukraine is in the position where it should be a natural energy exporter to Europe. In fact, on February 24th, 2022, right before the full-scale invasion, they tested their ability to export to Romania electricity. And there's no reason why, when the situation stabilizes and there's economic recovery in Ukraine, that they shouldn't be a net exporter of electricity to Europe.
No, we agree on that assessment. Have you seen China inserting itself into Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction efforts?
I haven't seen that so far. I've been in a number of conversations where the issue has been raised with Ukrainian government officials. I think there's a sense that on the part of the Ukrainians that they know who their friends have been during this conflict, and they won't soon forget that.
So you have been crystal clear in the dangers posed by potential Chinese influence in Ukraine's future to themselves.
Yeah, no, this has been a subject
because of the nature
of
of that type of partnership.
Yeah, I mean, I think the demand signal is there for U.S. business, for European business, high standards, respectful, and high-quality projects, technology, and equipment.
Thank you. Mr. Nathan, does the DFC have the resources that it needs to compete better against state-subsidized Chinese firms, broadly speaking?
Well, you know, I think head-to-head competition in that way is pretty difficult for us because we're not going to cut corners. We're going to be respectful of local laws and conditions. We're keeping to high standards, and we're looking for commercial viability in the projects that we do. If we're facing competition that is not as concerned about any of those issues, it's difficult to compete directly. The thing that we need is partners who recognize the long-term value proposition of what we offer and the competitive nature of that.
So speaking of partners, would the DFC benefit from greater participation from the State Department, where specifically the active participation of the chief of mission in a country that the DFC seeks to operate in?
You know, we benefit from that right now. It's very clear that what DFC has to offer is in demand by our embassies and the ambassadors in place. They understand that the value proposition of what we bring to the table is something that helps in the bilateral relationship that they're responsible for managing. So we, by and large, get very strong support from chiefs of mission, from their staffs, from USAID missions on the ground. And we work very closely with the State Department back here in Washington, D.C. Secretary of State is the chair of the DFC board. And we work closely with the State Department on issues around certification when we are going to make transactions in upper middle income countries. The State Department is responsible for that certification. We work closely on vetting and other issues in the analysis that leads up to our deal decision making.
And as you're going through this process, is there anything that Congress can do to improve that functionality through your own experience broadly?
Well, I look forward to discussions with you and this committee on reauthorization, because I think there's quite a bit we can do to improve on the very good work that the BUILD Act did, whether that's in relation to increasing the overall portfolio size at the pace of activity we're going, we're doing right now. We're going to hit the $60 billion total maximum contingent liability total portfolio cap quite soon, and I think it would be important to raise that to $100 billion or more. There's also issues related to our tools. I think Congress, whether it's equity or political risk insurance or loan guarantee authority, I think Congress intended for us to have broadly available tools, and there are some current restrictions on them that we'd like to see fixed. There's also a number of other issues related to our workforce and ability to retain and attract talent. That's important. The use of fees. In our appropriations bill for this year, we were able to use fees for transaction-specific costs. We'd like to see that made permanent. I think that'd be very helpful from the point of view of making us more efficient and effective for taxpayers.
Thank you for those recommendations, and appreciate all your hard work.
Thank you very much.
I yield back.
Gentleman Yields, I just want to add that risk insurance and loan guarantees are things that your office has provided to us to enhance this bill that we're working on. So thank you. Chair recognizes Mr. Sherman.
Been around here a long time. I once was chair of the subcommittee that no longer really exists that reauthorized OPIC back when you had an unfortunate name. Congratulations on a better name that doesn't confuse you with an oil cartel. Back then, we got at least as part of the reauthorization, assurances from your board and your predecessor's predecessor on a couple of issues. One of those was that you would not have as a private sector partner in your deals any organization that was violating our sanctions on Iran or that had a subsidiary or affiliate that was violating our sanctions on Iran. Does that continue to be your policy?
Yes, you know, when we do our know your customer and vetting of counterparts, that is something that is considered through the process, and that's something that we need to cooperate with our colleagues in the intelligence community to make sure that we have the most up-to-date information possible.
Do you require a statement from your borrower or private partner that neither they nor any of their affiliated corporations is violating our sanctions on Iran?
You know, I don't know if that's...
Let me ask it this way.
Yeah.
Will you, in the future, have a form where they say that they're not violating and none of their corporate affiliates?
Yeah, we'll definitely look into that.
Since you're asking Congress to reauthorize you, I hope you can give us a definitive answer that says that you will make sure that none of the corporate affiliates, because I don't want to see a circumstance where you have a parent company with several subsidiaries and one is benefiting from your program and the other is violating our sanctions on Iran.
I completely understand that, and that's why even more than putting language into a contract around that, we need to do the work to make sure that we understand corporate structures.
I hope you would supplement your answer in writing with something that's definitive, non-waivable. Another thing that probably concerns fewer of my colleagues than myself, but certainly concerns me, is to not have, it was a policy that you would not fund a pipeline or a railroad that was deliberately evading Armenia. That is to say, was going around Armenia from Azerbaijan through Georgia, when the natural way to build it would be through Armenia. Can I be sure that you're not going to be funding, and I realize some of this has already been built, so I'm not asking you about things that have already happened, that you'll not be funding a screw Armenia pipeline or railroad.
I can't imagine we would ever do that, so yes.
Thank you. Okay, the hearing of the theme of this hearing is somehow that we're responding to China. Your organization existed back before we made the mistake of giving China most favored nation status and back when China was a pygmy economically. Because you're doing a lot of good things that we would want to do, whether China was doing things or not. Have you continued to make money for the U.S. Treasury?
So across our portfolio,
Yeah.
for sure that we're making money. The financials that you'll see in our annual report for last year reflect some restatements based on the change of yield curve. And I don't want to get too technical about this, but the way the annual profitability, profit and loss of the DFC portfolio is taken into account, higher interest rates cause a restatement downward of the 20-year legacy portfolio we have. So last year, from that point of view, we did not make money. But what I think matters is the investments that we're making continue to pay us back, continue to pay their
And
interest
so you're
on
now
time.
evaluating investments on today's interest rates?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. And finally, I know we've urged you to cooperate with the Taiwan International Corporation Cooperation Development Fund as they tried in some small way to win over those that would otherwise side with China. Are you do you have an MOU with that Taiwan agency, and is it working?
Yeah, I have good news on that front. We just signed a compact with them. In fact, my colleague who traveled to sign that document is sitting right behind me. So, yeah, we're looking for potential ways to cooperate, potential deals in the Indo-Pacific and elsewhere that would make a difference.
My time has expired.
Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes Mr. McCormick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here today for your testimony. You just mentioned Taiwan and our agreements with them, the MOU. I think Taiwan is an extremely important, not ally, I guess, partner in the future of AI, which I think is going to be transformative to the entire world. As a matter of fact, I think they produce about 100% of our AI chips and about 90% of the world's AI chips, with Samsung as the other 10%. Interesting enough, China recently stated that they're going to take over Taiwan by 2027, which is worrisome to me. And it's even more worrisome to me that we haven't even delivered the things that they bought from us to defend their great nation. So I just wanted to point that out for the hearing, for the record, if you will, that we're not doing our part to help these people protect our assets, really. When it comes to investing further, you discussed Africa and you discussed some of the futures of energy. Now, what's interesting to me, if I'm not misunderstanding, the DFC decided not to pursue energy and infrastructure projects further when it comes to our investment overseas, or am I wrong in what we're trying to develop?
Energy is one of our 5 primary areas of activity that we're organized around.
Now, when we talk about energy, we're talking about comprehensive or just one particular kind of energy production?
No, we're looking across the board, so whether that's geothermal, as I mentioned, a gas project in Sierra Leone, wind, solar, and it goes beyond that. It's also looking to secure the critical minerals necessary for these projects. It's thinking about supply chain diversification and the manufacturing of energy components. It's in India, we worked on smart meters in order to increase energy efficiency. So it's all kinds of things.
I love all those things, by the way.
And nuclear, I should mention as well.
Yeah, we're underperforming on nuclear development in the United States. As a matter of fact, Georgia has done well.
Yeah.
I think we built the first nuclear reactors probably in the last 20, 30 years. That's the only state. We're way behind. When France is kicking your butt, you know we have a problem. But I will say this. 1958, we wrote the book, The Ugly American. Yeah. And it's kind of one of those things that you're actually trying to combat, is this idea that we're not in it to help other countries develop in the right way. What I'm worried about is we stand by and watch China overdevelop, or basically rape Africa, in my opinion, and our bad partners. And we're kind of putting all of our eggs in the same basket as them when we talk about energy production. Now, a lot of the solar panels, I love the fact that we're going to India to help, diversify our sources. But I do feel like we're falling way behind in our obtaining those rare earth minerals that we need for battery production, where I think China has, 80% of the market, if I'm not mistaken. And they're expanding that, by the way. It's not decreasing, it's increasing in their market share. They're using slave labor from the western part of China, as you mentioned previously. How do we combat that by, at the same time, while the way they manipulate the World Trade Organization since 2015? How do we do that with $1 billion, which sounds like a lot of money, but as you know, that doesn't go very far when compared to what China is investing in this?
Well, I completely agree that we're behind, but we need to start catching up. So you got to start somewhere. And so doing deals in critical minerals is very important to us. And this is where the equity tool comes to play. The United States owns 15% of a company called TechMet. We've provided equity in multiple rounds. That's helped them do a project in Brazil on cobalt and nickel. It's helped for rare earth oxides in Southern Africa. It's helped with other projects that they have under development, and we would like to do multiple rounds more of financing. But that's expensive. In the $1 billion that you mentioned that we have, 760 some odd million of that is our program budget. Equity on a dollar-for-dollar basis comes very dearly and uses up our appropriation very quickly. If we had an equity fix, we would be able to do a lot more of these early stage forward-leaning projects. Sorry.
We have to work on your terminology. Equity is kind of a dirty word nowadays. But just from my perspective, when I talk about equal opportunities for energy to succeed, and when we look forward, by the way, I'm always concerned about Brazil, and their government has some significant problems, in my opinion. I have to be careful who we partner with. But I also want to make sure we don't demonize the fossil fuels, which I think have been treated incredibly unfairly, especially when it comes to carbon emissions and why the Earth is heating. I'd love to have that scientific discussion going forward, but I'll table that for another time since we're almost out of time. But thank you for your time. Hopefully we can continue to develop our AI investment too, because I think that's incredibly important. Thank you. With that, I yield.
Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes Ms. Dean.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to Ranking Member Meeks. Thank you, Mr. Nathan, for your work and your team's work and your testimony before us today. I was interested in what you said in your written statement, that you're proud of DFC's track record, but also that you could do more. Quote, you say, the global demand for high quality, high standard development finance far outstrips the supply. I wanted to focus on that notion of high standard so we can have you paint the picture for us. Can you give me an overview of the environmental and social standards in your investment policies and explain how DFC involvement in a project guarantees the project meets those required standards?
So we follow the International Finance Corporation's performance standards. It's the kind of industry standard for like-minded development finance institutions. This is important for social displacement considerations, important for labor quality and labor respect. It's important for environmental standards as well. So each different project is analyzed for what sector it's in and the context in which it's operating to make sure that we're meeting those high standards. Internally at DFC, we have a group called our Office of Development Policy, which is our biggest area in terms of total employees. It's actually grown by 50% in the last 4 years, and it's critical for us to be able to have people who are expert to do the screening, to do the development impact analysis, to make sure the standards are met, but as important to then follow through once we do the transactions to measure and monitor and continue to work with our partners to make sure that projects are adhering to those high standards and are making the development impact that we expected when we entered into the transaction.
That's exciting stuff, and I'm wondering if you could offer us the contrast. How does what you're doing differ from offerings of competitors, as we've heard here today, such as Belt and Road Initiative? Are they finding ways to fill that demand, unmet demand, with low quality or low standard financing?
Yeah, to my knowledge, the kind of competition you're mentioning doesn't undergo any of the things I mentioned. It does not look for an analysis of standards. Often is not really respecting local laws and conditions, bringing in outside labor, and often the projects are inappropriate for the situation or not financially viable over the long term, or have serious quality problems.
Wow. I wanted to just end my part of my timing going back to what you said about Ukraine. Again, in your testimony, that the commitments in Ukraine by DFC are helping keep the private sector going at this critical moment, these are your words, while laying the groundwork for long-term economic recovery. I was able to be in Ukraine, in Kyiv, just about 2 weeks ago now, met with the president, met with military members. The appreciation for the passage of the supplemental passage was so palpable. You could see it in their faces, their eyes. But we also had the chance to meet with the American Chamber there, who seems to take the same approach. Not wait until this war is won, and it must be won by Ukraine, but to make sure that the economy, as much as can be going now in order to get ready for the rebuilding. The opportunity that I hope there is in rebuilding for DFC, but also for American companies, of course, for Ukraine. Can you tell us about your work there?
Yeah, and thank you for the opportunity, because I'm extremely proud of the DFC team and the work that we've done in Ukraine. I, too, have met with the American Chamber of Commerce in Ukraine every time that I've been there. I've been there 3 times. And they're a great partner in terms of connecting us to businesses, advocating for the businesses that have applied for financing, and working with us to help us with our business development. A great example of that is actually a company led by the chair of the American Chamber of Commerce in Kiev, a woman-owned business called Horizon Capital.
Yes,
and we had the real great honor of signing our $25 million limited partner commitment alongside our DFI partners, the EBRD and the IFC as well, in President Zelensky's office. He witnessed the signing, and this is the kind of project that will support the long-term growth of the Ukrainian economy by going to one of their strengths, which is information technology and that kind of entrepreneurship. This is a private equity fund that will fund those businesses, both in Ukraine and Moldova, another country that we're greatly concerned about. And I'm very proud of our investment in Horizon.
Delighted to hear just a little bit about it, and it's going to take all of us to partner. So thank you, and I yield back.
Julie yields. Chair recognizes Ms. Radewagen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Talofa lava, good afternoon. And thank you, Mr. Nathan, for being here. I had a couple of other questions, but you've already answered them very well, and I thank you for that. So how does the DFC plan to expand its Indo-Pacific portfolio beyond India? Does a new office in the Philippines help with this? PRC investment in construction projects frequently are in countries where the DFC is also active. Do you determine that the DFC has become a successful alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative? And what steps has the DFC taken to provide, as the BUILD Act clearly states, a robust alternative to state-directed investments by authoritarian governments?
Well, nowhere is that more important than in the Indo-Pacific from our point of view. Last year, it was the area of largest activity. We're able to do a little over $3 billion of investments in the Indo-Pacific. India was part of that, but so was Sri Lanka, so was Indonesia, so was Vietnam, et cetera. We would love to do more in the Philippines, and that's why opening an office in Manila is on our to-do list. We need to work with Congress to make sure that we have both the resources and the approval to do that. But that's important. We have currently 4 employees, full-time employees, stationed throughout the Indo-Pacific, in Jakarta, currently in Bangkok, in Singapore, and in Mumbai. But we'd like to have more, and we'd like to also have some locally employed staff. It's very important for helping to build deal flow and help find the kind of local contacts and business opportunities that are key to making the kind of impact that you mentioned that's so important and crucial to our mission.
I think you mentioned earlier that there are some countries you do not work with because of their income classification level, and yet China doesn't let anything like that stop them. They work in all countries. They'll take whatever it's given to them.
Yeah.
So, very interesting. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Joe yields. Chair recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Meeks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I heard, unfortunately, I missed your questions in regards to equity, but I just want to let Mr. Nathan know that the chairman and I see that exactly alike and want to make sure that we're helpful there in any which way we can. And thank you for all that you're doing, Mr. Nathan, at DFC. Now, my question to you is that many Caribbean island countries, they don't fall within the World Bank's low or lower middle income categories. And that's in part because their small size and few large foreign-owned investments can skew their GDP. It makes it artificially high. Average residents, nevertheless, face great challenges in keeping pace with the uniquely high cost of living that the World Bank openly does not account for. And these island nations have significant development needs that stem from disaster risk, climate impacts, and the difficulty of securing necessary infrastructure. So, my question to you is, why do so many small island countries fall through the cracks for DFC investment? And how are you working to expand DFC engagement in the Caribbean? And what tools can we do to help you provide them?
Well, as you know from our previous discussions, finding ways to expand our impact in the Caribbean is a big priority for us. We're working within our current authorities to do that. I traveled in December to Dominican Republic and Jamaica, both of which are categorized as upper middle income countries, so that we have a few more challenges in working there. But we have been able to do recently some projects in the Dominican Republic. We did a $200 million on-lending deal there to support small business. And we've also announced that we're going to open an office in the Dominican Republic to help propel our activity throughout the region. We'd love to do more in Jamaica as well. One of the challenges we do have, though, is this income classification question. If we were able to move more to the World Bank lending categories, a number of Caribbean island nations which are not currently eligible to receive DFC projects would become eligible. I think that would be Trinidad and Tobago, St. Kitts and Nevis, Antigua and Barbuda would move from currently not eligible to being eligible. It's true also in Central America. Panama would go from not eligible to eligible, and some nations in South America as well. So that would be an important change for our ability to make a difference in the Caribbean.
So, is there anything that we can do in Congress that you think that can make it?
In reauthorization, one of the things that we would like to see changed is moving away from the current World Bank income classification categories to these World Bank lending categories, so those nations that I mentioned would become eligible, and we could work with private sector partners in those countries as a result of that change, whereas today we're not able to.
And similarly, we just had a meeting with a number of foreign ministers, prime ministers, ambassadors from the Indo-Pacific islands. And as we're trying to compete there with China and doing their, is the DFC at all prioritizing any of these Indo-Pacific islands?
So the Pacific Island nations are also an area of great concern. There are a lot of challenges in working there. One is the income classification question. A couple of the nations would move from ineligible to eligible. There's also the challenge of just the extremely small size of the economies and the fact that they're dominated by the state sector. We do need private sector partners in these countries to be able to work. Nonetheless, we were successful in Papua New Guinea and 5 other Pacific Island nations in doing a telecom deal, along with our Australian and Japanese counterparts. And we have a couple deals in the works in other Pacific Island nations. We do also have the challenge that some of the countries where we would like to work, we don't currently have what's called an investment incentive agreement. Without that, we can't work there. And we've been trying to get, for example, in the Solomon Islands, one of these agreements in place. It's just from a diplomatic point of view quite challenging to do.
Let me ask this also, because there's some of this, the concept of additionality, which is essential to your work. This means that through its work, the DFC must mobilize the private sector capital that would otherwise not be available to finance projects. So what challenges has the DFC experienced in mobilizing investor enthusiasm from the private sector side, whether it's the Indo-Pacific, whether it's the Caribbean islands, or in general?
Yeah, you're exactly right, and this speaks to the question about the dominance of the state sector in these small economies. If we can't find a private partner, if there's not an opportunity to support a private business or a private project, it doesn't meet the additionality requirement you mentioned. So that is a great challenge. We're trying to be flexible and find as many projects on the edge that we can in order to try to be able to make a difference in these countries that really would benefit from increased U.S. involvement and DFC support.
Thank you. My time has expired. Yield back.
Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes Ms. Titus. I'm sorry, Mr. Barr. He just showed up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Nathan, good to see you again.
How you doing?
Thanks for your leadership. I had to step out, so if I'm asking a question that's already been answered, just let me know. I did want to touch on this equity scoring issue. I'm sure you have addressed this, but DFC does have a great tool that it can wield equity, yet it's been unable to fully unleash the potential of this tool. How has the budgetary treatment of equity expenditures impacted the DFC's ability to enter into projects that would counter the PRC?
So if we had this issue fixed and we had the ability to deploy more equity capital per year, I think we would be able to address the mandate that Congress has given us more directly. We would be able to be more forward-leaning on risk. Just by definition, equity would allow us to be earlier in projects and in a capital structure position that is of greater risk than being a senior lender, which is normally the case.
Yeah.
That would allow us to exert influence earlier in projects, to take projects that are more on the edge of making a difference in these countries, whether it's infrastructure development, energy, or the other areas where we work.
I do think the expected returns of an equity investment should be reflected in the budgetary cost, and we recognize that some DFC investments, by the very nature of where they're going, can be higher risk, but let's operate in the real world. High-income country classification, you've also addressed this, but you know, as I travel to places like Panama, where China has investments on both sides of the canal, there's a geostrategic problem with that. There's immense strategic value to the United States, yet because of the World Bank income classification, DFC is barred from entering into new projects there. Panamanians, other higher income countries say, look, we would prefer to do business with American investors, but you're not here. So can you give examples of China's Belt and Road Initiative projects in high-income countries? And obviously, do the Chinese have the same type of restrictions as the DFC when it comes to investments in higher-income countries?
The policy-directed banks of China don't have any such restriction, and as the ranking member was also asking about, if we were able to change, moving away from the World Bank income classifications to World Bank lending categories, a country like Panama would move from currently ineligible to eligible under the analysis that we've done. And I think that that would be all to the good. I completely agree with you that being able to find highly developmental projects, even a country like Panama that's classified as high income, is still a great possibility and would make all the difference strategically.
Well, there's certainly some soft power value to just economic development in distressed parts of the world, and it shows that the United States is a better partner than our adversary in Beijing. But I think the focus for DFC should be strategic. Number one, strategic. How can we displace malign Chinese investment irrespective of the income category of the target? Taiwan. As co-chair of the Congressional Taiwan Caucus, I'm chiefly concerned about the CCP's efforts to economically influence Taiwan's diplomatic allies. Since the DPP came to power in Taiwan in 2016, Taiwan has lost half of its diplomatic partners. China offers bribes, market access, investment to bring countries into its orbit. How is DFC working in countries like Paraguay, Guatemala, Palau, the Marshall Islands, and the Pacific to offer an alternative to PRC financing that may come at the cost of Taiwan's diplomatic relations?
You may have been out of the room when we were discussing it, but we did recently sign a compact with our counterpart in Taiwan to work together to find investment opportunities that we could work on together. That's true in the Indo-Pacific or in the Western Hemisphere.
Well, sorry to make you repeat that, and I'll...
No, but what I wanted to mention was about Guatemala, which is an area where we've become recently very focused. There's all sorts of reasons for that, including the one that you mentioned. We've done 5 projects in the last 2 years, over $100 million to support affordable housing, small business, and we're looking for more. I had the chance to meet with the newly inaugurated president when I was at the Munich Security Conference, and I think the environment for us there is extremely favorable.
My time's running out. Thanks for the work on Taiwan to help its diplomatic ties. Subic Bay. We've got Cerberus in there buying a shipyard. How can DFC encourage more investment with U.S. and allied companies in Subic and in the Philippines?
Well, in the Philippines is a priority for us. We need to up our game there, and the Subic Bay redevelopment might provide a good opportunity to do that.
Great. I yield. Thank you.
Chairman yields. Chair recognizes Ms. Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Nathan. I certainly agree that the DFC is an important part of our international development strategy and policy, and it's also a good way to try to effectively compete with China. I also believe that our policy should be value-directed and not just based solely on competition with another nation. And I think you agree with me on that. I want to ask you, though, I hear about the high end, the low end, the middle end. We use one characterization for this country, another for something else. It seems very confusing. And the people that I talk to often say they can't figure it out if they qualify, and sometimes they're not responded to or there's no follow-up after meetings. So I think it would help to kind of get some handle on how you make these decisions. For example, you're supposed to focus on low and lower middle income countries, but you got many projects in high and upper income countries like Mexico, Argentina, Georgia, Oman. Then there are some lower and middle income countries that I think would be excellent candidates, like were mentioned in the island countries, and yet you say you won't work with them. And then to add to the confusion, you maintain a list, and this is on your website, that says these are the countries we can't support, and then you list Oman and Singapore as places that you are supporting, but they're both on the list of the countries that you can't support. So you can see why people are not sure how this works or how we can make it work better or how the countries or the companies that might be interested in investing can get a better understanding before they go through the process if they meet some of these categories. Now, I know the legislation is difficult to deal with because it allows all these waivers, but could you help us with that a little bit?
Yeah, on the income classification, I think it's pretty straightforward, and I apologize if our communications on our website don't make it appear to be that way. Congress has, within the BUILD Act, required us to only work in low income, lower middle income, and under certain circumstances, upper middle income countries. The only exception to that is in Europe for energy projects under the European Energy and Security Diversification Act exception. I think part of the challenge that you may be facing in the information you just laid out is the difference between countries where we're currently eligible to work versus investments in our portfolio from our predecessor agency or from previous years. Part of the problem with the income classification categories is they change every year on July 1st. Mm-hmm. Some countries move from middle income, upper middle income to high income and become ineligible. Some move downwards. There's volatility every year, and you can imagine that if we're in the middle of working on an investment on June 30th, then in July 1st the country becomes ineligible, we then can't do it by
you just
law.
Stop?
We're required to. There's no possibility of a waiver. That's the statutory requirement. So that, was, I think, a well-intentioned but difficult to administer criteria for how we work. We're very concerned that the World Bank is about to revise its way that it does the income categories. And we've heard that dozens of countries are going to move into categories in 2025. That could be quite devastating for our work if there are large-scale movements of these categories. That's why we wanted to go more toward the World Bank lending categories, which don't have the same degree of volatility and take into account many of the things you mentioned, which are focusing, would be to focus us on the least developed countries in the world.
Is that some reform that we can
Yes.
enact in the reauthorization?
That would be one of our highest priorities for Congress to address in reauthorization.
Thank you. That would be helpful. Thank you. I'll yield back.
Generally yields. Chair recognizes Ms. Kamlager-Dove.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witness for being here today. DFC is probably one of the most important development agencies in our toolbox, and it's essential that we reauthorize the DFC in a timely manner. Also, your work on the African continent, I think, offers important development options for countries that are looking for partners to support their growth and want the U.S. to provide a viable alternative. So what kinds of projects or in what sectors are you seeing the greatest demand on the continent?
Well, it's really across all sectors. There's enormous appetite for our financing in Africa and the many countries in Africa where we work. In infrastructure, in the last year, we've done an airport in Sierra Leone. We're working on a railway investment. We'd be very interested in port investments in Africa. In health systems, there's a huge opportunity in Africa for local vaccine manufacturing, for health clinics, for diagnostics, for food security, whether it's processing better storage, helping to enable smallholder farmers to disintermediate middlemen and be more productive. And of course, there's appetite throughout the whole continent for support for small business. That kind of entrepreneurship and small business requires financing. That's how these businesses can get off the ground and make the kind of economic impact that is so necessary.
And so how do you all collaborate with other development finance institutions and multilateral development banks in Africa to increase the scale and reach of your investments?
This has been a huge area that we've devoted a lot of resources to since DFC launched. It was part of the underlying motivation of the BUILD Act, was to enable us to be a better partner. So we work with our G7 partners. The Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment is a G7 initiative to help pool our capital, make us more efficient, and provide the kind of alternative. We also work with the European bilateral DFIs quite a bit. I've attended many meetings, many of my colleagues have worked closely with them, and we've brought together these groups to think about sharing deal flow, due diligence, and other ways to make us more efficient. It's also true with the regional multilaterals. We try to find ways to work with them. The Inter-American Development Bank is a very important partner for us, and we've recently created a platform agreement to share deal flow and due diligence. And then, as we've been talking about during this hearing, in the Indo-Pacific relationships, a trilateral infrastructure partnership with our colleagues in Australia and Japan, a trilateral partnership with our Korean and Japanese counterparts. We have MOUs with Taiwan, with Singapore, et cetera. These are all part of, I think, the sort of global environment of our partners realizing the challenge we face, and that if we don't work together, we're going to be worse off.
Yeah. So my understanding is that Guyana is categorized as high income and so.
I think that's right. Guyana is high
And
income.
do you see value in, I know you've talked about restructuring it so that we can have access to newer and different partnerships. I see value in partnering with that country. Can you talk about some of the opportunities that could be available to us?
Well, Guyana would be one of the countries that if we moved from income classification to lending categories would become eligible. because it's not currently eligible, I don't really know that much about the environment for potential deals there, but it would be
And I
one of those
apologize, we're down to the wire on votes, and
No,
more than welcome to keep talking.
No, that was the end of my line of questioning, so I would yield back.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Nathan. And members may have additional questions for you in writing. We look forward to working with you on this legislation, and I think it will enhance your ability to do your job. And so thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks for the opportunity, Mr.
Committee
Chairman.
stands adjourned.